Hello and welcome everyone to this session. My name is Alison Castle-Kane. I work for Trinity as the Head of Business Development for the UK and Ireland for language. And I am delighted to be moderating the English for Specific Purposes strand. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Alina Reid. Alina will be doing a session, Writing at University in the Digital Age, aligning institutional expectations with student needs and abilities through effective language assessment. So this session is very much about how language assessment can and should respond to the needs that are evolving with students at university level. Alina works for Trinity College London as a test developer. She has an extensive background in English language teaching and teacher training. She's worked in Spain, Vietnam, and the UK. She holds an MA in language testing from Lancaster University. And her interests include assessment of English for academic purposes, authenticity in performance-based testing, rating scale design, rater training, and standardization. So I'm really pleased to kick off this session with Alina. If you have questions as we go along, do pop them in the chat. Feel free to interact with one another and comment. And I'll probably join Alina in the last 5 minutes just to recap on any questions from the audience. So over to you, Alina.
Thank you, Alison. And hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's lovely to see people from all over the world. Some people from Vietnam, where indeed I was there for 3 years teaching English at the time. So let me tell you a little bit about my role and context these days. I'm a language test developer. And I worked on developing the ISE Digital, which is a 4 skills language test that Trinity developed to be used for academic study, for employability, and for visa purposes. Now, in particular, I led on the development of the writing module of this test. So I did quite a bit of research around writing, and this research informed the way we designed the writing tasks on the test. So today I want to share with you some of the key findings we gathered along the way regarding writing at university, and I hope you'll find these useful, whether your role is oriented towards teaching writing or designing assessment tasks, or perhaps even making curriculum decisions or decisions about what kind of tests people should be taking before arriving at university. So there's going to be quite a bit of information. If you have any questions, yes, please pop them in the chat. If some of the slides have too much information, please take a quick screenshot of it, and you can look at it later. But I'll hopefully try to talk us through everything. So our test development journey started with doing quite an extensive review of the literature around writing at university to find out what it is and how it's done. And what we know is that writing is essentially a problem-solving activity. It's a very complex activity in which we try to achieve something specific and use our linguistic and pragmatic resources to tackle a communicative problem. In the academic context, we also know that we can broadly distinguish between 2 types of writing. So firstly, we write to communicate with others and to navigate the environment around us, the school environment in the case of academic context. And secondly, academic responsibilities often require students to write longer, more complex pieces of text. And the purpose of such writing is typically to acquire, to transform knowledge, and to display learning. It's the kind of writing we traditionally recognize as academic writing, and it's the kind of writing that's typically assessed. Now, there's a bit of overlap between the two, but broadly speaking, we can distinguish between these 2 main types of writing. And I'll talk a little bit about each in turn now. So, as I said, there is a bit of common ground between them, mostly the fact that they are both, again, trying to achieve a purpose. in the case of academic writing, this purpose kind of tends to be imposed on us by our teachers. In the case of communicative writing, we often define our own communicative goals. They are also nowadays almost entirely done through the digital medium in most parts of the world, to the point where digital literacy is almost synonymous these days with literacy itself. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. And this is why we can't really assume that because somebody can do one type of writing well, they can do both, because they are quite different. So when it comes to communicative writing, what students do these days is that they engage with a huge variety of audiences, and this is ever growing. So obviously it's the faculty, staff, teachers, and other students at their university, but also much further afield these days, because of all these technologies, students create their own discourse community in their study field, and they're interacting with audiences from all over the world, from very different backgrounds. So what this means is that they have to enact and adapt to many, many reader-writer relationships, which can differ a lot based on social power dynamics, cultural background, and so on. So they have to adapt to all of this. They have to execute many very blurry genres. In communicative writing, everything is changing almost by the day in terms of genre. So just to give an example that I find pretty obvious is, what is an email these days? And how does that differ from a direct message you get on Teams or Slack or other such platforms? The line is very blurry, and you have to know exactly how to write depending on who, what for, and so on. So all this means that students need to have very, very strong functional and sociolinguistic skills in order to cope with all of this. And they need resources related to collaboration and cooperation, which generally tends to be what communicative writing is all about. That's communicative writing. Academic writing is, it's a lot more stable. It doesn't change day by day, although these days it is, with generative AI, things are changing, but it is still more stable and less susceptible to change. Generally speaking, the audience is the teacher. Certainly when it comes to high stakes assessed writing, it's still the teacher who reads the text and awards a score in the vast majority of cases. So it's also expected to be formal and academic in tone, whether tone and formality vary a lot in communicative writing. In academic writing, it's a lot more stable. And there are specific genre conventions they need to follow, and of which we have identified that the essay and the report are still the two main genres which are relevant across all the disciplines, humanities and sciences. Very importantly, academic writing is intertextual. And that's because at university, students very rarely are asked to write independently simply about their own opinion, their own experience. That doesn't really happen. What tends to happen is that they're asked to engage with sources, they're asked to critically evaluate them and integrate them into their own writing. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Okay, now we've looked at the literature. We have a pretty solid idea of what writing is and what we should be teaching and assessing if our aim is to help students develop the right skills and competencies. But in our context, the context that Trinity College London operates, which is high stakes and large scale, we need to do more. We need to do empirical research. To check that what we learn from the literature actually matches the reality on the ground. So that's what we did. We collected stakeholder perceptions about to find out what they think and what they know about writing at university, to see how they compare. So I'll talk you through the study that we did. We designed a study which involved 50 EAP, so English for Academic Purposes, teachers, and 90 international students, and overall 20 UK universities were represented in this study. As you can see, we tried so that our participants cover a broad range of language backgrounds, fields of study from across the disciplines and educational levels at university. And all of these 90 students had taken an English language test as part of their admission procedure. The vast majority had taken IELTS Academic, and a handful of them had taken TOEFL IBT or Pearson Academic. And I mention this because it's important, because ISE Digital is meant as an alternative to these tests. So this means that this group of 90 students is representative of the people who would take the ISE Digital. It's also important that at the time of data collection, they were all enrolled on either a general English for academic purposes or an academic writing course. And again, this is important because you may know that the purpose of an EAP course is to help second language speakers develop language proficiency, but also academic skills which are needed to succeed in higher education. So what does this mean? It means that there should be quite a lot of common ground between what happens on these courses, so what kind of writing is taught and assessed on these courses, versus the kind of writing that we see on language tests, such as IELTS or ISE Digital. There should be a lot of common ground if we are assessing the right things. So we used questionnaires, we did semi-structured interviews after that with some of the participants. And I have to say that 40 out of the 50 teachers agreed to be interviewed. So our data is very rich in terms of what EAP teachers in the UK think about writing at university. And today I'll talk about three main findings. So what are students write? What kind of writing do they need to do at university? What does the university expect them to do in terms of writing? And how do students' ability and competency compare to what is expected of them? And I'll organize the findings along these two main types of writing: communicative writing and academic writing. And I'll start with academic writing because it's a chunkier bit of writing. So what we did here is we identified 4 task types which we thought were most relevant to academic writing at university. You can see them there at the bottom. So writing from sources, essays, reports, and contributing to forum discussions on virtual learning environments such as Moodle or Canva. And we wanted to know if students and teachers felt that these tasks are frequent in their context and if they're important for academic success. And before I show the results, I'll give you the opportunity to have a think about these 4 task types. And if you want, please use the chat function to say which task you think came out as most frequent out of these 4, or perhaps which task came out as least frequent out of these 4, and pop it in the chat if you want. Okay. Well, our participants, the majority of them felt that all of these tasks are frequent. And you can see that in purple, or very frequent, and you can see that in dark purple. And they also thought that they're important in yellow, or very important in dark yellow. So here you're only seeing the percentage of strong or very strong agreement with these statements. But you can infer from the little bit that's missing at the top of the bar that only a small percentage disagreed that these tasks are frequent or very frequent, and almost none of them strongly disagreed. And I should say that here I have aggregated student and teacher responses because there weren't any significant differences between them. So I've aggregated them together. Now I want to clarify here, we asked them for writing from sources as different from reports and essays, but from the comments they wrote and from the interviews that we had, it is very clear that academic writing is source-based writing. So whether we're talking about reports or essays, they are writing from sources. In fact, in terms of isolated, independent writing tasks, so the kind of task where you just give them a topic and ask them to write from their opinion, only came up at 3 universities out of the 20 that we surveyed. And I also found it interesting that the report, if you look there at the third task, the report, it shows up as less frequent, but almost as important as the essay. So we dug a little bit deeper into this during the interviews, and it's because it turns out that on EAP courses, the students don't do that many reports. However, on their other courses at university, so their disciplinary, normal, if you will, courses at university, they do reports quite often. And this is why they're still perceived as important or very important by about 84% of everybody who responded. And during the interviews, many teachers, in fact, expressed some concern about this unevenness of the EAP curriculum. Are we really benefiting students by favoring the essay genre so much compared to the report? Does this really help students with their writing across the university context? So, and that's the report. I thought that was worth commenting on. And also, I think writing on forum discussions is worth reflecting on for a minute, because I also thought it interesting, even though it's not as frequent, it is not assessed, and often it's not even mandatory. 60% of students and teachers agreed that it's important. So I asked, why is it important if it's not assessed and it's not frequent? And many participants felt that it enriches and diversifies the learning experience. It gives students the chance to enter a critical dialogue with their peers and co-create knowledge. And teachers in particular felt very positively about this kind of task, and they even felt it was predictive of academic success. So students who are more active and engage with these tasks tend to do better in other aspects of academic life as well. We also wanted to see if there are any other tasks we had not considered. So we asked an open-ended question. Here you can see a very simple word cloud to just give you a sense that most of the responses just kind of repeated the options we gave them, or mentioned subtasks you might do before writing a report or an essay. So for example, summarizing, note-taking, planning, and so on. There were 2 tasks which stood out as different. So presentation slides, which makes sense. There is some writing involved in making a presentation slide. But I feel that is perhaps better assessed together with the speaking element when you are presenting the presentation. The other one was reflective writing. Now this came up a total of 22 times, and at the time that surprised me a little bit. So again, I asked a bit more during the interviews, and it appears to be a relatively new, let's say, task type, which has been popularized more recently as a result of generative AI. Now, my focus was not, my research was not focused on generative AI, but many teachers commented about it a lot. So I got a snapshot of what EAP departments across the UK are experimenting with, implementing, or contemplating to tackle the generative AI challenge. And some are experimenting with new assessment tasks, such as the reflective writing one. But teachers did also express some concern about this task, some uncertainty rather than concern. So, for example, we don't know, is reflective writing representative of writing across all the disciplines at university, and it would need to be. If we're going to test it on English courses, it's because it's useful for students across the disciplines, and it's not entirely sure yet. I think more research needs to be done there. And also, it seems like it's no less vulnerable to AI plagiarism than any other task. So time will tell whether reflective writing is here to stay or just an experiment, a quick fix. And on the other extreme, other departments are instead reconsidering or reintroducing some form of timed, invigilated test because they feel that it is the only way of assessing a student's true writing ability. Right? And speaking of assessment, we wanted to know how it's done. So we asked teachers what criteria they use to assess academic writing. They gave us a lot of information and we coded this. We identified the 5 most common assessment criteria, and you can see this on the slide here. You can see that use of sources is a big part of what's assessed about writing at university. And this includes, of course, stuff like referencing and paraphrasing, but it also refers to more critical, more conceptual aspects, such as making selective and critical use of the sources. And we also wanted to get a sense of the relative importance of these factors. So we gave teachers a list of determining factors of writing quality, and we asked them to rate them in terms of how important they are for academic writing. And obviously, most teachers said that all of these are either very important or very important, but not to the same extent. So I wonder if you want to have a look at these criteria and think which one was considered less important out of them all, and share your opinion in the chat if you want. I'll give you 5 seconds. So which one of these factors would teachers feel is less important compared to others? Okay, I can see there is a comment there, and yes, indeed. Right? Most of them felt that they are all very important, but answering the question with relevant supporting detail, organizing, and selecting relevant source content is most important, whereas grammar and vocabulary less so. And it was also interesting to hear that because of generative AI, many EAP departments are actually considering deprioritizing grammar and vocabulary altogether. So either not assessing it at all, or if they do assess it, give it lower weight compared to the other criteria. So we get a clear sense that grammar and vocabulary, yes, okay, they're important, but other more critical aspects, more intertextual aspects of writing matter far more. Now, those of you with experience of teaching in the EAP context, I'm sure you will not be surprised by any of this. But what is less clear is how well do English language entry tests, which students have to do before arriving at university or to be admitted into university, how well do they reflect this reality? How well do they succeed in assessing these abilities, in promoting these skills, in preparing students for what they actually need to do at university? And we will come to that in a moment, because we also asked participants, okay, so how well do students cope with academic writing? And here it's worth showing you student versus teacher responses side by side, because the difference is quite striking. So all the information in yellow represents student responses, and all the information in purple is teacher responses. And you can see that while the majority of students feel confident or even very confident in dark yellow about their ability, very few teachers felt the same. And this discrepancy is particularly obvious when you look at writing from sources, where nearly 70% of students felt, yeah, it's fine, no problems there, whereas only 4% of teachers felt the students can do this well. So when asked more openly, okay, what aspects are difficult, nearly all teachers mentioned ability to use sources, as you can see in this purple comment there. And teachers mentioned use of sources 45 times. And it was striking to me that students only mentioned it 14 times, even though there was nearly twice as many students as there were teachers. So there were 90 students and 50 teachers, right? Instead, the area of difficulty students kept talking about was vocabulary. And you can see that in the yellow comment. Now, to be fair, some students did identify critical use of sources as difficult. You can see that in that bottom comment there. But overall, there was an obvious disconnect between teachers versus student perceptions, both with regards to their actual ability and with regards to what the source of the problem really is. And during the interviews, teachers mentioned the notion of unlearning problematic behavior a lot. Problems related to self-referential, isolated writing. And when asked, okay, why does this happen? Most of them refer to general lack of exposure to UK-style academic writing, or they pointed to the fact that most students prepare for language tests, which give them an independent essay task. So here's your topic, answer it based on your own opinion and nothing else. And this fails to prepare students for the realities of academic writing, which is heavily to do with using sources. And it even teaches them problematic writing practices. So I think there is a lot to think about there for those of us who design language assessment, or those who make decisions about what kind of what we should be teaching, what we should be assessing before students get to university. Okay. I'm going to move on very quickly to communicative writing. Again, here we identified 4 types of communicative activities, and you can see them at the bottom there: writing messages to teachers, to other university staff, to other students, and participating in group chats. And again, we asked the same question: does this kind of writing happen frequently, and does it have an impact on academic success? Here, you're again only seeing percentages of strong or very strong agreement that these tasks are important and frequent. And you're seeing again joint student and teacher responses, because there wasn't much difference between them in this case. So you can see most of them said all writing types are frequent in purple and important in yellow. We also asked them, okay, is there any other kind of communicative writing the students do, but nothing stood out as different. You can see that on the right, so I'm not going to dwell on this. Instead, I will say that in the interviews, we asked why this writing is important, because it's not assessed, right? So why is it important? And participants mentioned that written communication allows students to access information, to access learning resources, or extracurricular opportunities and facilities. It allows them to ask for help when they need it and to offer help. So overall, it's essential to thriving in the university environment, even if it's not assessed at university. And sadly, it tends to not be assessed prior to getting to university, but we'll get to that in a minute. We wanted to understand the institutional expectations around how students are expected to communicate at university, because, okay, it's not assessed, but their expectations do exist. So we asked teachers, what makes this kind of communication successful? You can see some comments there on the side, on the left, but I'll quickly summarize. Brevity, nobody wants a 5-paragraph email. Clarity, formality, tone, and generally being able to flexibly match the context and audience. You can see that bottom comment there mentions this idea of mirroring back the person you are writing to. Extremely important. And again, all of this might seem obvious or at least intuitive, but the question is, I'm sorry, you can see on the right a similar sort of trend in terms of criteria and how important they are. Similar trend, grammar and vocabulary, not as important as informing your reader, giving them logically ordered information, and writing appropriately. So again, perhaps obvious, at least intuitive, if not obvious, but the question is, are students aware of these expectations and can they meet them? So we asked about that too. Here again, you see student and teachers side by side. Student responses are in yellow, teachers are in purple, so you can no doubt notice the huge difference between them. So students, again, quite confident in their ability to communicate in writing. Teachers, far less convinced, far less impressed, especially when it comes to the kind of communication where they are at the receiving end, so messages to teachers and to staff. And when asked, okay, what aspects are difficult? Teachers, you can see their comments in purple there, focused heavily on those problems we just, on those criteria we just talked about, politeness, formality, coherence. They feel the student writing is often too informal, but sometimes it goes to the other extreme where it's weirdly, overly formal or oddly antiquated, especially when they use AI translation software. As you can see in that bottom comment there. And so it's not just a matter of formality and stylistic convention, it's also a matter of problem, of content, because many students seem to be unaware of what amount of information is appropriate. Most of them don't include enough. Some of them include far too much with all sorts of irrelevant and far too personal details. So this stuff is always, it's not something that AI can necessarily help with. So the solution isn't as simple as just use AI, write more formally, include more information, because it really depends on the context, on who they're writing to, and what they're trying to achieve. And even if they ask ChatGPT to write an email for them, they still need to be aware of what kind of tone, what kind of formality, and what kind of content is expected of them in order to prompt effectively. It's different if you're writing for a teacher to ask for an extension versus you're writing to a colleague to ask for some notes. So the question is, are students aware of these expectations? Let's see, because we asked. Now you saw earlier all of the things that teachers mentioned in terms of what is difficult about communicating in writing. When we asked teachers, some of them said none. I wonder, or a variation of this. Not difficult, it's easy, no problems, and so on. I wonder if you can guess what percentage. I was going to get you to guess what they said was most difficult, but I skipped ahead. So what percentage, I wonder, do you think said no problems? I don't have much time, so I'll tell you that it was 30%. 30 out of 90 students said they had absolutely no problem with communicative writing. It's super easy. So you can see that worryingly, many of them are not aware of the expectations they're facing, and they're not aware of the negative effect they have on their teacher. Someone's even even more pessimistic, 85%. It was only 30%, but I still thought that was quite drastic. And to be fair, some students actually are aware. For example, this student here comments on her struggles in communicating in writing. Right, so some are aware that being both clear and not offending your reader is difficult. But overall, the emerging picture is that many of them struggle to communicate effectively. Some avoid it altogether, so they are at risk at not being able to fully take advantage of resources, help. They're at risk at feeling excluded, isolated, and helpless. So again, we asked why. are students so under-equipped for what is really a quite basic type of writing. And most teachers and students commented on simply a lack of experience, lack of exposure, and lack of adequate preparation. Many teachers felt that students should receive this direct instruction and they should be tested on it before they arrive at university. Many also felt that they should be able to teach this themselves on their EAP course, but there simply isn't enough time because the syllabus is already packed with all of the academic writing requirements, which student already, there's a huge gap in academic writing, so there is no time for communicative writing. And again, I think this is all food for thought for those of us who are designing or making decisions regarding what kind of learning, what kind of testing needs to happen before students arrive at university. So I'll quickly summarize our conclusions and what that means for us in assessment. To thrive at university, students need two types of writing, not just one. Academic writing is very difficult. It's assessed through source-based writing, not through independent writing tasks. The main criteria: content organization, critical source use, rather than language and vocabulary. Students face a steep learning curve and a considerable amount of unlearning. And when it comes to written online communication, many of them are unaware of their shortcomings and the impact on the reader. So the conclusion is the students, they need more exposure and more instruction in real life academic writing. And I think one way of supporting and empowering students is by designing or selecting language tests which simulate real world writing and test these very skills. Because if you test it, they will learn it, which is otherwise known as test washback. And this is what we set out to do with the design of the writing module of the ISE Digital. So I'll very quickly talk you through the two types of tasks we have, because I think you'll see it's very obvious that we have captured these two types of writing. We are measuring communicative writing ability through the written online communication task and academic writing through a writing from sources task. Just to very, very briefly talk you through both of these. The written online communication task uses 3 versions because we want to capture that rich variety of audiences and communicative situations students find themselves in. And on the day of the test, they could see either a forum discussion, which simulates a collaborative discussion like they do on Moodle and so on. They might get a group chat, so the kind of communication which needs to happen when students work with others, perhaps on Teams, WhatsApp, and all sorts of other platforms, or a one-to-one direct communication. And regardless of the version, I do want to point out that for this task, they are recommended to spend 5 minutes and write 70 words, no more than 90 words, because we're reflecting that real-world digital communication where the expectation is for a brief and concise message. When you write an email, there is no such thing as write at least 150 words. On the contrary, you should keep it as brief as possible. In terms of assessment criteria, you can see that language is only one of 3. 2/3 of the mark come from content and style, so register and tone. And I think I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'll very quickly just talk you a little bit through the other task, which is writing from sources. It takes an integrated skills approach to replicate those intertextual and critical aspects of composition, which we see in the real world. There is a report and an essay version, and regardless of the version, there are 2 or 3 source texts, which they have to integrate into their response without copying. And one of the 3 source texts is can be an infographic, so a pie chart, graph, or something like that. And I will take a final minute here to stress that the kind of use sources that we expect here, because you can see on the right the assessment criteria captures use of sources. But what kind of use of sources is expected? It's not just summarizing, and it's not just faithfully relaying what the sources say. they are expected to make selective, adaptive, and interpretative use of sources to suit the new audience and the new purpose for writing, because it's this type of critical use of sources and interpretative use of sources that's expected of them when they arrive at university, because it's the only kind of writing that actually transforms your knowledge. You don't transform your knowledge by summarizing simply. You have to evaluate and critically integrate. So this is precisely what we assess, because we feel that by including this task type, we're confident that we will encourage students to start developing these skills before they arrive at university, and narrow that gap between what they know how to do when they arrive at university and what they're expected to do, which is going to be a lot more than what you get in a tech task on a high-stakes, large-scale test, but still it will be much closer to what they're expected to do than what some of them are currently preparing for. So yeah, very briefly, we're covering these two types of writing because we want to give learners those skills across the writing range, because we know this is the kind of writing they will encounter at university and beyond. And I hope you have found this presentation helpful if you create your own assessment task, or perhaps you make decisions about what kind of tasks to include on your course or in your context. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Elena. Oh, yes, you've got your references there.
Give it 5 seconds for anybody who wants to do a quick screenshot.